From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name's Will Ellsbury. I'm the military history specialist for the main reading room here at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you all today. I know we're competing with President Lincoln for the second inaugural, so we have that to go up against. So we're co-sponsoring this event with the LCPA What If Science Fiction and Fantasy Forum. If you want to sign up for future programs, on the sheet outside, it's available out there. Their next program will be April 30th. Rob Shelsky, whose most recent book is The God Factor, and he'll talk about writing multiracial science fiction and fantasy. And you can also join the What If Forum on Facebook. I want to introduce our chief, our division chief for the Humanities and Social Sciences Division, Jane Sanchez, please.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jane Sanchez, and my title is Chief Humanities and Social Sciences Division. Today's program is being video recorded for later display on the LC website. By attending today, you are giving consent to be included in this recording. If not, now is your chance to escape. I would like to welcome our speaker, Peter Tsouras, and all of you to the Library of Congress and to today's talk. This presentation is part of an ongoing series of lectures in the arts, humanities, and social sciences sponsored by the Humanities and Social Sciences Division. Today's talk is also co-sponsored by the Library of Congress Professional Association's What If Science Fiction and Fantasy Forum. The LCPA What If Science Fiction and Fantasy Forum hosts lunchtime programs featuring all things fantastical. You can follow What If on Facebook or contact loke@loc.gov for more information. Our guest today is author Peter Tsouras. Mr. Tsouras is a historian, retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency, where he was a senior intelligence officer. He is also a retired Army officer. He has authored or edited 23 books on military operations and alternate history. He has written many studies in intelligence and military studies and various journal and magazine articles. Another book that he's recently published, related to Britannia's FIST series, is Scouting for Grant and Meade, The Reminiscences of Judson Knight, Chief of Scouts, Army of the Potomac. It was published by Skyhorse Publishing, 2014. Judson Knight is also a prominent character in the series that Mr. Tsouras is discussing today. Mr. Tsouras is also working on a biography of General George H. Sharpe, a prominent character in this series. All three Britannia's FIST books are available for purchase today, and Mr. Tsouras will sign books after this presentation. So for those of you who are interested, please join. Today's presentation coincides with the final months of the National Civil War sesquicentennial observance. That's a tough one to say. Throughout the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, the Library of Congress has actively presented a number of commemorative exhibits, lectures, and sponsored many events to honor this great event. In addition, the library has worked to preserve the history of this important observance by archiving a selection of several hundred websites dedicated to the Civil War sesquicentennial. This web archive will be publicly available soon, so please stay tuned. Mr. Tsouras will speak for approximately 40 minutes, and we are reserving time for questions. Please join me in welcoming Peter Tsouras. Thank you.
It's a great honor to be here at the library, and the library has supported my research wonderfully over the years. It's one of the great monuments to learning in all of history, and I appreciate being here. I want to say a word first about my wife, Patty, here. My companion, my friend, my helpmate through 40 years, 3 careers, 3 children and 2 grandchildren. To her, I also owe thanks as a great supporter of my writing. No one.
I think you might need to use the microphone.
Okay.
The microphone, please.
No one has ever been a greater supporter of someone's writing than my wife. And to her sleuthful turn of mind, I was able to transcribe a huge amount of 19th century handwriting, which is often not easy. I appreciate also the advice that she didn't give. For example, the first time I attempted alternate history was in 1992 when the grand old man of British military publishing, Lionel Leventhal, came to me and says, you know, in 2 years it's going to be the 40th anniversary of D-Day. I think there's a niche there. There'll be, umpteen nonfiction works, but I think there's a niche there. Let's have the Germans win. And Patty thought this was a bad idea, but thank goodness she kept it to herself, and it did well, and the result is now you're all here. Lionel knew just about everybody, and one of them was a former president of Israel who during World War II was in the British Army. And it was this sergeant and his squad that captured Heinrich Himmler. It's one of the juster ironies of history. Now, Heinrich got caught because when he knew the game was up, he and his staff were going to change into SS uniforms for enlisted men. And he insisted on wearing the only corporal's uniform. Well, the Allies had a policy of letting all of the SS privates go, but keeping all the NCOs and officers. And a corporal is the lowest rank of NCO, so they caught Heinrich. And they figured out who he was. And by the time they dumped him out of the back of the truck at headquarters, he was black, blue, and bloody, which probably convinced him to bite on the cyanide pill he had in a false tooth. So that was my beginning with alternate history. I want to talk first about General Sharpe. This is his picture here. I believe he was the man responsible for the victory of the Union in the Eastern Theater. The organization he created and the system of all-source military intelligence he created was the force multiplier, the combat multiplier that made the difference. Now, you take away the information he was providing first Meade and then Grant, and especially Grant in the 1864 Overland Campaign, I believe Lee would have fought him to a bloody standstill. Now, after the war, because of this association and everything he had done for Grant, they had become the closest of personal friends. And in 1873, Sharpe invited him to stay at his mansion while he was president in Kingston, New York. And he took him to a big, lavish dinner at a place called the Overlook in the mountains nearby. And as soon as they came in, this beautiful young woman puts her arm through Grant's and starts walking along with him. And Grant is so married, right? And so uncomfortable. He's trying to make conversation and said, "Do you read Shakespeare?" And she gushed, "Oh, yes, I read everything of his as soon as it comes out." Oh. Okay. Something else about Sharpe. He was well liked. In fact, in writing this biography, I came to like him very much. There was a personal association, too. Both our mothers were named Helen. We had both had 3 children, 2 boys up front and a daughter. And both of our daughters were named Catherine. But aside from his military contribution, he was the only Civil War general to build a statue to his men rather than the other way around. And these men were devoted to him in his regiment for the rest of his life. He was also the only general to set up an allotment system so that the men's pay could be given to their families. They would give him their money on payday, thousands of dollars. He would take it to Washington to the Nest Bank, you know, the Gold Dome Bank on the corner of M and Wisconsin, and deposit it, then write a check to his uncle, who had a bank in Kingston, New York, with the instructions on how much to pay each of the families. He was also a great supporter of the 14th Amendment and African American civil rights in Republican politics in New York after the war. Grant made him the U.S. Marshal of the Southern District of New York in 1870 to break the Tweed Ring, which was falsifying federal elections to the House. And to cut a long story short, there was an incredible showdown. The Tweed Ring, which controlled the National Guard, wasn't going to take this lying down. And they had filled a couple of these regiments full of their thugs. And they were going to call them out and intimidate the U.S. Marshals and the supervisors of elections. Grant put Sharpe in command of the military garrison of New York, and the naval garrison. They brought in thousands of troops quietly and hid them in the city. And then Sharpe had a come-to-Jesus talk with the mayor, and the Tweed Ring blinked. They won the election, but they were never able to falsify another one, and their power disintegrated thereafter. So this is a remarkable man, and because of his intelligence work, he figures prominently as basically the central character of this trilogy. In order to understand or write a trilogy like this, you have to understand the world as it was at that time. The United States and Great Britain nearly came to war twice during our Civil War. The first time was during when we seized a British packet in 1861 and took off 2 Confederate diplomats. We were technically in the wrong. By international law, the British, who had done this thing for 150 years to everybody else, got their noses out of joint, were threatening war, and the Russians came in and advised us, give these people back, you're in the wrong, and Lincoln swallowed his pride and did that. And more later about the Russian involvement. So the second time we nearly came to war was in early September 1863 over the Laird Rams. Now I'm going to back up a little bit. When the South seceded, there was great joy in many British government circles and financial circles because they did not want the American experiment to succeed. There was a great deal of animosity towards the United States, which was freely returned. The British and Canadians like to refer to Americans derogatively as Jonathans. We were brash, we were arrogant, we thought too much of ourselves. And if you read all of these British travel logs of the United States, they're all negative. They have almost nothing good to say about the Americans in the United States. And the Americans freely returned this. So there was not a lot of good feeling. On the contrary, the British lower classes were very supportive of the Union. Now, Jefferson Davis, early in the war, embargoed cotton to Britain and France, hoping that cotton starvation of their major industries, cotton production, would force them to come in on the side of the South. Well, this backfired. It only put hundreds of thousands of British mill workers out of work. They held hundreds of meetings in support of the South. Support of the North, not one in support of the Confederacy. And the Union, people in the Union were astute enough to send 50,000 barrels of wheat or flour to the relief of these mill workers. So British public opinion is split, but the governing circles want the experiment to fail. They also want the bloodshed to fail. And they want to organize an international forced mediation of the Civil War, Britain and France in particular. And this forced mediation would inevitably result in Southern independence. But the Russians came to our aid and frustrated every attempt at a unified position by these powers. So nothing happened. Why would the Russians do this? Right? The preservation of the American Union became a major foreign policy objective of the Russian Empire. Why? Well, first of all, we had no strategic problems between us. We were both developing vast continents, and so we were trading information and experience. The Americans were building the first Russian rail network. Russians were buying warships and guns from us. And as far back as the American Revolution, Catherine the Great had been approached first by the British for mercenaries, and she said that my subjects are not for sale, so we were spared the spectacle of Cossacks in Massachusetts. Pardon me. And then she formed the League of Armed Neutrality to fight off British attempts to interfere with neutral commerce with the Americans. But more importantly, the British had burned the Russians so badly in the Crimean War that the Russians feared the British world hegemony, and they saw the United States as the only counterweight. So they gave us vital diplomatic support throughout the war. For example, with the instance I just spoke of, because we were amateurs, and the Russians were very good at diplomacy. Now, the second flashpoint over the Laird Rams. The British had a neutrality law that was very badly written, and you could sail a commerce raider right through it. And it allowed the Confederacy to build commerce raiders in British yards. The U.S. government would press suit in British courts against this, but invariably sympathetic British judges and juries would let them off. And so you had a number of commerce raiders built like the Florida and the Shenandoah and especially the Alabama, which savaged the American merchant marine to the point where Lincoln had to go back on his strategy of one war at a time and issue an ultimatum to the British in early September of 1863. Let me back up a little bit to the year before when the Alabama escaped from the British yards. We were pressing the British government to seize this ship before it left port. And the British were finally stirred after great pressure to do something about it. But a Southern sympathizer in the British Foreign Office alerted the Confederate agent named James Bullock, who, by the way, was the uncle of President Theodore Roosevelt. He was the brother to Teddy's mother. And a little aside there, the reason Teddy Sr. didn't join the Union Army is because his wife, who was Southern-born, threatened to leave him if he did. So he did great work in the Sanitary Commission, which is providing relief to the wounded and sick and everything like this. So the Alabama leaves port with this warning under the excuse that it's just going for a trial run, which means it did not need the official permission of the chief customs officer of the port. So off of Wales, it's joined by its crew. It sails to the Azores, where its guns and military stores are loaded onto it, and then it embarks on this reign of terror across the seas. Well, the American merchant marine, which before the war had just edged out the British merchant marine in the carrying trade of the world, was now in ruins. About 800 ships had been either destroyed or put under bond. Thousands of others had been sold to foreign owners or reflagged, mostly to the British. So this is all to British advantage. Well, the crisis arises because now the British, the same yard that built the Alabama, is building the two rams. This is the Laird brothers in Birkenhead, which is just across the Mersey River from Liverpool. And these ships are unique. They're all armored warships, all iron ships, and they have turrets, armored turrets. These are the first turreted warships built in Britain. And our consul there, named Dudley, who got that cushy job because he had been instrumental in getting Lincoln nominated in 1860, was running an incredible intelligence program, and he was getting all of the specifications for the ships and their intent. And he was providing that to the government back in Washington, and it caused great alarm. They thought that these ships would be invulnerable, would be able to break the blockade of the southern ports and then come up and ravage northern ports. And this was a deal breaker. Lincoln finally goes back on his policy of one war at a time and issues an ultimatum to the British. And our ambassador, Charles Adams, grandson of John Adams, son of John Quincy Adams, it was a family post, penned probably one of the most famous lines in American diplomatic history to the bottom of this. It would be superfluous of me to say that this means war. Well, in reality, okay, we're not into alternate history yet, Lord Russell, who was the foreign secretary, goes, ooh, I think they're serious. And even Victoria wrote in her diary at that time, it says, geez, yes, we'll lose Canada outright if we go to war. So they moved to seize the ships, okay? And they were seized not on point of law, but on as a matter of state, and were bought by the Royal Navy, okay? And they proved out to be duds. Another irony of history. But this crisis over the Laird rams is my point of departure. All right, and I will reveal just a little bit of what's in the first book. If that same Southern sympathizer in the British Foreign Ministry had also warned the builders of the Laird rams, one of them gets out. Now, again, in reality, as this crisis is building, Secretary of State Seward asks the Secretary of the Navy, can't we send a ship to intercept these rams if they get out? Oh, no, we don't have enough purpose-built warships for this. Well, again, one little change, and this sparks a British declaration of war, right? And so history goes off in a totally different direction. Now, I had always been intrigued by several issues surrounding the Civil War. And one of them is a war between the British Empire and the Union. Now, if it had happened earlier, over the earlier incident, we would have been beaten hands down because we didn't have a large trained army at that time. It was all amateurs. Our industry hadn't been ginned up, and the people hadn't been really enthused. But by late 1863, all of these things had come to pass. We had a large navy, we had a large veteran army, industry was producing weapons, right, and a great deal of other supplies. So the Union has a fighting chance at this point. Fighting chance. The British industry had 20 times the output of the industry of the North at this time. Okay. British exported 40% of their iron to the United States. We were just sucking this in because of the expansion of the United States, including most of the iron rails we were using. By late in the war, we were producing all of our own rails. Okay? So the industrial production of the Union had really ramped up. Another thing that was fascinating to me was, well, getting back to World War, is the involvement of Russia. Would Russia have allowed Britain and France, because France wanted to be in on any war with the Union, would Russia have allowed the destruction of the Union, and hence the only counterweight they saw to British world hegemony? Okay, this is a balance of power decision. And in October of 1863, guess what arrives in New York and San Francisco? The Russian Navy. The Russians had another reason for coming in on the side of the Union at this time. Early in 1863, the Poles had risen in revolt again, and the Russians had crushed them with a heavy hand, which is the way the Russians always do it, right? And so Britain and France, which had guaranteed the Kingdom of Poland, all right, the survival of the Kingdom of Poland, threatened war because the Tsar had abolished the Kingdom of Poland. He had been king as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. And so they were threatening war. And so another reason the Russians, or probably the main reason the Russians sent their fleet out, was to get it out of their own ports so that if war came, they could issue onto the high seas and start commerce raiding the British. Okay. So the Union just went crazy over the arrival of the Russians. And the Secretary of the Navy writes in his diary, "God bless the Russians, because they've come in on our side." Or anyway, that was what the government wanted the Union population in the North to believe. And these people were partied from Boston to Washington. Rimsky-Korsakov, the great composer, was an ensign on board, and he gave performances in New York, and they took them all up to Niagara Falls for a little vacation. So this is the world, the international world, and you can see all of these connections. Now, France wanted the Union to lose because it wanted to keep Mexico, which it had just taken over. So a broken United States isn't going to knock France out of Mexico. Another issue that I found fascinating is military technology. Now, everyone is usually of the opinion that the Civil War accelerated military technology. And a great many things were. The telegraph played a vital role, railroads played a vital role. But when it came to weaponry, the real story is how this technology was retarded, if not outright sabotaged. As early as the early 1850s, at the Crystal Palace Fair in England, the British had been amazed by Sam Colt's revolver, and it became a standard weapon. This was an example of American military technology, which was racing ahead of the British. The British in the Crimean War, which started in 1853, found that they could not meet their needs for the new Model 1853 Enfield rifle, superb muzzle-loading rifle from private producers. And so they sent a delegation to the United States to look at the American method of production, meaning interchangeable parts. And Springfield Arsenal rolled out the red carpet for them and then gave them introductions to all sorts of American industry. They got basically a blank check from the British government, which was that desperate, and they bought hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of American machine tools to outfit the completely rebuilt Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield, which is just a London suburb now. And they were able to produce these beautiful weapons en masse, and British industry followed with the American method. They even hired away the chief engineer from Springfield to be the manager of that factory, which became the pride and joy of British industrial production. So we were ahead. We were ahead, especially with repeating weapons. The British produced this superb Springfield rifle, whose ammunition was interchangeable with our Springfield rifle. And let me diverge here a bit. Another issue is the fact that without British supplies, the Confederacy would have folded within 1 year. if it had to rely on its own ability to produce weapons and munitions. But the British became the arsenal of the Confederacy. And I would say that most of the bloodshed in the Civil War was due to British logistics for the Confederacy. At Vicksburg, when it surrendered, every Confederate soldier had a brand new Enfield rifle. Grant's forces were armed with inferior weapons, and so after the surrender, he just had his regiments come in and exchange weapons. During the siege of Petersburg, he sends to Secretary of War Stanton a box, an ammunition box, stamped Royal Arsenal, Woolwich. The British were even buying Midwest bacon in New York, shipping it to Bermuda, and then shipping it to Wilmington, North Carolina. So Robert E. Lee's army is eating Midwest bacon supplied by the British. And the reason this was important is because they had been tearing, because of the damage done by the Union to Confederate railroads. In order to repair them, they had to tear up feeder lines into their own agricultural hinterland, which meant that the produce couldn't get to the armies. There was no way to get it anymore to the troops. So it was vital that it had to come through from Bermuda to Wilmington, North Carolina, and then by railroad up to Richmond and Lee's army. Military technology, again. The repeating weapons. At this time, there were a number of good repeating rifles that were being developed, if they had not already come into production. But the Army's Chief of Ordnance Bureau, Brigadier General James Ripley, affectionately or unaffectionately known by his staff as Ripley Van Winkle, was adamantly opposed to the adoption of any of what he called newfangled gimcracks. All right, and he said it would just interfere with the production of the standard muzzle-loading weapon. Lincoln had to come down to his office directly and give him a direct presidential order to buy these weapons. And still he would sabotage the contracts in the fine print. If they're late one day, the contract is canceled. Lincoln was a great friend of military technology. He was the one that authorized on the spot the creation of the balloon corps. He was the one that saw the demonstration, the American repeating weapon, which he nicknamed the coffee mill gun because it had a hopper on top you fed the ammunition to. It was the first machine gun. And he bought 10 on the spot, and then he forced McClellan to buy another 50. And they were used once in combat and just slaughtered a Confederate cavalry squadron. But Ripley made sure they all ended up back at the Washington Arsenal, all polished and oiled and useless. General Fremont in the West said, "I've heard of these guns, I want some." And they have his correspondence where he's lying and saying, "I've never heard of these things." Now, he was honest as the day is long, and he got good value for what the government did buy, okay? But because the talent pool of people like this, who were experts in logistics and production, was so small, they couldn't get rid of him. They literally had no one who could replace him. At least he was getting the production of the standard Springfield rifle up, right? But that meant that the advantage of repeating weapons was lost. Berdan's sharpshooters had been promised the best repeating weapon, but Ripley kept sabotaging the orders and saying, "No, I'll give you this Springfield." They finally mutinied, which was the only reason they got some repeating weapons. Troops had to buy their own. Some regiments bought their own, and later the government they figured out a way to reimburse these people. And the Confederates were terrified of these units because of the volume of fire. Just wilted them, burned them out. And Ripley, it never occurred to Ripley that, well, he would say that, we can't afford the logistics of supplying that much ammunition. Well, how many battles are you going to have to do that with if you got 10-to-1 firepower advantage over the enemy? What happens if this goes away? Okay? We also had problems in naval technology, too. But our guns, the naval guns, were the best in the world. That was because of Admiral John Dahlgren, who was the father of American naval ordnance, who took the muzzle-loading gun to its highest capability, so much so that the British wanted to buy these before the Civil War, and we said no. This gun had several models, had 9-inch, 11-inch, and 15-inch. And the 15-inch had a 400-pound shot that could smash the side of any British warship, especially their new armored warships. The British had been building what we call broadside ironclads, basically traditional broadside gun, the guns all coming out through the sides, but armored. It was an all-metal ship. But they were putting guns on them that were inferior to the American guns. The best British gun was the Armstrong 110-pounder, and this is a interesting innovation, breech loader. But the British Army had ordered all these breech loaders too. The Navy said, we want them too, but the designer said they're not meant for the sizes you want on naval ships. And the breech wouldn't seal properly, the vent would blow out, and the corrosion of being at sea with all that salt tended to make things worse. But anyway, in reality, they removed all these guns in 1864. But if the war starts, they're stuck with them. All right, 110-pound was the heaviest shot the British had, and our 11-inch was 172 pounds. With great penetrating power. The 11-inch, again, 400 pounds. And tests showed that they would have blown big holes right through these British broadside ironclads. And the British were committed to this type of ship. We were building the monitors. All right? No British gun could penetrate the turret or side armor of a monitor. Okay, so our military technology, in a way, was advanced. But we didn't have the experience in large-scale production. The first class after the Monitor, the Passaic class, was very good. But then the follow-on class, they overdid it. They went too far. The chief engineer of the Navy thought he could out-engineer John Erickson. And they were making millions of calculations in his office, and there are lots of mistakes. They don't realize that producing ships along the Ohio is different than producing them along the Atlantic. What happens to the Ohio? It freezes, and then the water level goes down at different times of the year. None of the companies that had produced these weapons or these ships had ever built a ship before or a warship before. And so the ships are late, and when they're late a year, and when they're finally dropped into the water, the first one, its bow has only 8 inches of freeboard and its stern is underwater. And that's without guns, stores, or anything else. Total failure. Other issue is the role of military intelligence. Like I said, Sharpe was vital for winning the war, but his military intelligence organization was at the first of all, the Army of the Potomac level, and then Grant brought him up to his Army Group level. There was no national intelligence organization that could take information from the entire war effort and put it together and support all of the armies in the field. And it would be more than just the order of battle and the tactical information. It would be strategic and operational analysis too. And this was a big mistake, not to have created something like this. During the Gettysburg campaign, as Lee is marching into the north, everybody and his brother in Washington is sending information to the Army of the Potomac. Right? It's called raw raw information. It's not analyzed. The different, I should have said it first, what turns information into intelligence? Analysis. Okay? There was no analysis at the national level. Anything they would hear, they would just send on. Now, if there had been a national intelligence organization, it could have supported the war much better. It would have had a vastly better coordinated war effort. And if you're going to world war, you're going to need people that can understand an enemy. It's one thing to try to figure out what your own countrymen are doing. They speak the same language and everything. But what about if it's European powers? So you're going to have some organized solution here. Now, I'm positing this world war. And you see all these problems the Union had in reality. What are they going to do better? How are they going to do better? Why are they going to do better? Dr. Samuel Johnson once said, "The prospect of being hanged in 2 weeks concentrates the mind wonderfully." Okay? In order to survive, the Union has to go into total war mobilization. And that means you've got to rationalize things. You're going to have to break a lot of iron rice bowls. You've got to basically, like I said, rationalize what you're doing. That means an industrial plan like we had, for example, like we had in World War II, where resources can be allocated according to strategic priority, where scarce or valuable skilled labor can be allocated and rationalized, and where you can use a national intelligence organization to support the war effort. And this is what I do in the book, in the trilogy. You see this process of rationalization. Sharpe creates the the Central Information Bureau, which the motto of which was, "We share information," which, having come from the intelligence community, that is not one of the things that one associates with the CIA or the FBI. Okay? In fact, the CIA is known affectionately, I think, in some places as the Klingons. Anyway, so this is the world upon which these stories are based. Sharpe especially runs through this as a central character, because the intelligence activity is in many ways paramount, because it's going to determine how you view the war, how you view what the enemy's doing, and what you're going to do because of that. So, also Lincoln figures in this prominently, as you might expect, and it's clear to me that he was a superb war leader. And with all of these, the ability to now put new technology into gear. For example, balloons. The balloon corps disappeared after Chancellorsville because it had no patron. The president couldn't do everything. He couldn't be everywhere. They drove the contractor, the chief aeronaut of the United States, out of the Army. And then there was no one else who could pick up the slack, and that was the last time balloons were used. But the Confederates were terrified of the balloons. In fact, at Gettysburg, they made significant errors because they were attempting to hide from the balloons, from the observation by the balloons that weren't there. Right? So think if these things this technology had been pushed forward on a rational basis, okay, that the whole country has to come together and push this forward. Submarines were another thing too. We actually had a submarine, but it never really got into operation because it sank when it was being towed down to the blockade of Charleston, and they didn't build another one. So when you have the resources of the country now, all rationalized, you can start doing things like this. This wipes away a lot of problems when the whole country now sees itself as facing as an existential threat. One other thing that I put in this on a domestic level, a domestic threat, were the Copperheads. Anyone familiar with the Copperhead experience? Yes. Copperheads were those people, mostly Democrats, who were opposed to the war for the Union. And Lincoln had a severe problem with them. Grant said they were worth another 100,000 men to the South. It just wasn't, their damage just wasn't free speech influencing the North. It was suborning of desertion, interference with recruitment, other acts that were against the law. But sympathetic juries and judges were not prosecuting or convicting these people. So Lincoln suspends the Great Writ, which the Constitution allows because it says it can be suspended in times of invasion or insurrection. The problem was that it doesn't say who gets to suspend it. But as in Congress was out of session, wouldn't be back for another 6 months. So he said, look, the rules of the tranquil days of peace simply don't apply. And he later said, I'll bend the Constitution here and there in order to save the entire document. Because if the Union failed, the Constitution would fail with it. And then where were all of your civil rights? Which is something that the radical civil libertarians never really took into account. The interesting thing is that all the people arrested by the Army under this were released after the war. The British were amazed that we didn't hang thousands of people. In fact, these Nigerian officers told me 30 years ago that they actually studied our Civil War during their Civil War to find the optimum way to end it, which is why they even went beyond us in reconciliation. They took people back into the Army, into their civil service, who had gone over to the rebels and everything. The Copperheads were doing more than this. They were actually plotting to destroy the authority of the federal government in the three big Midwestern states. They had collected thousands of small arms. They had raided government warehouses and killed the guards. They brought Confederate officers up to train them in order to liberate all these Confederate prisoner of war camps in the Midwest. Camp Morton in Indianapolis, Camp Douglas in Chicago, and the one at Rock Island, and then arm them with all these weapons, and then take these states out of the Union. And so this was not they just kept losing their nerve, all right? So, but it doesn't take much to just tweak it a little bit, and somebody actually sets this, it puts a match to this trail of gunpowder. In fact, Democrat politicians were going up, these Copperhead Democrats were going up to Canada and getting gold from this Confederate Commission in Niagara to finance their campaigns. The government was fighting back, and they arrested one newspaper editor who was found with hundreds of revolvers and 30,000 rounds of ammunition in his offices, and he turned state's evidence. He says, yes, we were going to revolt, kill the governor, put the Democrat lieutenant governor in office, and recall all of Indiana's regiments from the Army. Okay, so this was a serious threat. So on top of World War, you have a domestic revolt, right? Which, imagine what is happening in the North at this time, right? Well, this puts an end to the anti-war feeling of the Copperheads, right? And it unites the country. So you can see what a unified country can do under the circumstances of World War II, when we faced an existential threat from fascism and the Japanese, and we became the arsenal of democracy. I wanted to, I have to apologize for the rapid ending of the third volume, because I had anticipated writing 5 books, and at the last minute the original publisher said no, so I had to tie things up a little too fast. But my agent is dickering to get with a new publisher, 2 more volumes. So maybe I can take the war off to Europe, and have a Hellenic. I'm speaking my Hellenic fantasy of the Russians liberating Constantinople, and putting the cross back up on the top of the Hagia Sophia. Are there any questions? Yes.
When are you going to write a book about President Romney's successes in the Midwest and the Middle East?
I try to stay deep into history
Maybe a wise decision.
because I find historians who write about things that have happened in their own lifetime tend to be not as dispassionate or objective as they should.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
And
But
it's good to see you again, Pete.
Ah.
Chuck Simonton.
Oh, Chuck! Shadows back there. I didn't see you. It's really good to see you.
Yeah.
This was a genius.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. He was a sergeant when I came to work for Army Intel, and went to school and became an IT guru. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk about how you use the library's collections in your research?
Oh, yes. A lot of it was to develop the Sharpe character in the writing of the biography of Sharpe, which again figures into the trilogy. There are a number of photographs that are vital, that were important. I found the John C. Babcock collection in the manuscripts division. Babcock was Sharpe's order of battle genius. He had been a soldier working for McClellan in the Peninsular Campaign, and became the most famous scout in the Union for a while, and a great map maker. He was an architect and a draftsman, and he hung on after McClellan left, and was there when Sharpe was given the job of being basically the intelligence officer for the Army of the Potomac. And he went on to run all of the order of battle, which was of incredible detail and accuracy. He was able to figure out that before the Chancellorsville campaign, Lee's ration strength within 1.5%. Okay, so that was all in there, and also it's the orders of battle in his beautifully precise hand. And these things were passed out down to corps and division level. And there are only shadows of this left, but his letters there are in there. Also went through all the presidential papers that were in there. There are numerous references to Sharpe. There's Grant's presidential papers that you've got a collection of, and he's in there a lot. And it's able to build this image of Sharpe and his capabilities. So it was a very fond experience. And the finding aids were very good. Yes?
I just had a comment and then a question. If anyone hasn't read the series yet, it's really worthwhile. It's very vivid, and it was very easy to visualize. I think it would make a very good either miniseries or movie or something. But beyond that, how did you give a correct voice, at least how, as you saw it, to all the different characters that you brought in, both British and American and
You have
nationalities?
to understand these people, what motivated them, what their histories were, and they all have to act in character. Someone who had been timid all of his life can't suddenly be a lion in battle. And the people, especially Sharpe and Lincoln, and I've read an immense amount about Lincoln, and you could almost get under his skin, and I almost felt like I understood what he would say at this point. Disraeli was another one. Absolutely fascinating man. And he's Lincoln's opponent in this war. And they're not villains either. I mean, everybody's got his perspective and national interest and everything, and so they're not, one-dimensional villains. Yeah, look at Hooker. Hooker's not going to change too much. But you have to put him in a position where his talents will come out. He's still going to be a womanizer, you know, you just have to get under the skin of these people. You have to understand them. They have to all be in character. Yes. Anything else on that regard?
No.
What did you think of the characterizations of these people?
Like you said, I didn't see any cardboard or fake characters. They all seemed very well fleshed out. You know, they all seem to speak as they should. And there were no real surprises, as you said, like Chamberlain, Joshua Chamberlain. I'm just trying to think of some actual of the historical people that read. The way, like you said, Hooker.
Or the French Marshal Bazaine.
Yeah.
The fact is, you don't have to do anything with them. Keep them as they are because they're fascinating just as they are. And let them be themselves. And it works that way. And although I would vastly enjoy getting a miniseries out of this, I would shudder to see what they would do with some of these people, like the execrable movie Troy, where they thought they could write a better story than Homer. And anyway, any more questions? Yes.
What major generals in the Civil War did you change their prominence, such as the battles that took place in Tennessee and then in the Eastern Theater? Did you change any of that based on intelligence that might have changed?
Well, not yes, because, for example, Hooker, after he left the Army, was at loose ends. But he was the only other man who had commanded an army. And you could make a point that his loss at Chancellorsville was due to a lot of things beyond his control. And he's going to be in a position where he really needs to redeem himself. So with the British invasion of New York, and let me back up. The British actually had a war plan they developed in 1861 against the United States. And part of that was to seize Maine. They had some really terrible Paul Mill analysis that said the people of Maine were sick of the war and would be glad to rejoin the empire. More importantly, that was the windpipe of Canada. The first international railway, the Grand Trunk Railway, ran from Halifax in Nova Scotia down through Maine, Vermont, into Quebec, and the rest of Canada. And that was the only link the British had or the Canadians had with Britain. You sever that, boom, Canada's lost. So the British that's why the British wanted in this war plan to seize Canada. I just threw in also that they decided they'd come down from Quebec straight towards Albany, which is only 35 miles, right?
Speaking about the role of intelligence in this reimagined war, did you have Pinkerton interact with Sharpe?
No, Pinkerton had gone back to Chicago at this point, and never occurred to me to bring him back. They had never worked together because Sharpe joined his regiment joined the army after Pinkerton had left. Okay. And although it's interesting, Babcock remained friends with Pinkerton. It was a small group. There was Babcock, and there was a Captain McEntee, and a Lieutenant Manning. And that was the analytical staff of the intelligence operation of the Army of the Potomac. And it's amazing what they could do with just 4 people. So, another general that achieved prominence So the French invade Louisiana from Mexico, and one of the corps commanders is General Franklin, who had been disgraced in military political infighting with the Army of the Potomac, and had been sent off to this backwater. Well, because of the change here, he suddenly achieves prominence. And this is the sort of thing I would do. Because one thing always leads to another. Yes. Any other questions? Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.